The storm outside the Blackwood Manor was not nearly as cold as the atmosphere inside the master bedroom. Thomas, a 70-year-old shipping tycoon, lay motionless on his king-sized bed. A massive stroke a month ago had robbed him of his speech and paralyzed the left side of his body. To the world, he was a fallen titan. To his children, he was merely a living obstacle standing between them and a vault worth $400 million. Richard, the eldest son, paced the room with a glass of expensive scotch in one hand. His eyes, sharp and predatory, never left the heavy steel safe embedded in the mahogany wall. "He's still breathing too loudly," Richard muttered, his voice devoid of any filial concern. He reached over and callously switched off Thomas's hearing aid. "There. Now we don't have to listen to his struggle, and he doesn't have to hear us planning his retirement." Julianne, Thomas's only daughter, was busy reapplying her lipstick in the reflection of a silver tray. "Do you think the lawyers have a digital backup of the will?" she asked casually, as if discussing the weather. "The firm said the only original copy, the one with the final amendments, is in that safe. If we don't get the code before he, well, passes, we'll be stuck in probate for years." Sitting at the foot of the bed was Mark, the son-in-law. A lawyer by trade and an opportunist by blood, Mark was the one who had brought the small whiteboard and a dry erase marker. He placed it on Thomas's lap, forcing a stiff, unresponsive hand to hold the pen. "Come on, big guy," Mark whispered, leaning in so close that Thomas could smell the desperation on his breath. "Just 4 digits. That's all we need. You can't take the money where you're going. Why let the government have it when your loving family is right here?" Thomas's right eye flickered. He looked at them, his flesh and blood, and saw only vultures circling a carcass. He remembered the nights he spent building his empire, the sacrifices he made so they could attend the best schools and wear the finest silks. Now, they wouldn't even give him a drop of water without asking for a price. Richard stopped pacing and stood over his father, his shadow eclipsing the old man. "You've always been about discipline and merit, Dad. Well, here's a lesson in reality. Merit doesn't matter when you can't move your legs. Give us the code, or I'll ensure the nurses forget your pain medication tonight." The room fell into a suffocating silence, broken only by the rhythmic thumping of the storm against the windows. Thomas's hand began to tremble. Slowly, painfully, he began to move the marker across the white surface. The 3 vultures leaned in, their hearts racing with the rhythm of pure, unadulterated greed. They didn't see a father in pain. They saw a combination lock finally clicking into place. Thomas finished writing and let the pen clatter to the floor. On the board were 4 numbers, 1-9-5-4. "The year Mom was born," Julian gasped, already rushing toward the safe. As Richard dialed the numbers, his fingers shaking with excitement, he didn't notice the faint, glinting spark in his father's eyes. It wasn't the look of a dying man. It was the look of a hunter who had just set the perfect trap. The heavy bolts of the safe groaned. The door swung open, but as the interior light flickered on, the triumphant smiles on their faces vanished, replaced by a chilling confusion. There was no gold. There were no deeds. There were no diamonds. Only an old, dusty tape recorder and a single gold lighter. The heavy door of the safe rebounded against the mahogany paneling with a dull thud. Richard reached inside, his hands frantic, expecting the cold touch of gold bars or the crisp rustle of high-value bonds. Instead, his fingers brushed against cold plastic and metal. "What is this?" Richard hissed, pulling out the ancient tape recorder. Julianne and Mark crowded around him, their faces pale in the dim light of the bedroom. The vault, their sanctuary of promised wealth, was hollow. Julianne grabbed the gold lighter, turning it over in her palm. "A lighter? He doesn't even smoke. This is a joke. A sick, senile joke." She turned toward the bed, her face contorted with rage, but Thomas remained still, his gaze fixed on the ceiling, a ghost of a man. "Play it," Mark urged, his lawyer brain already calculating the legal ramifications of a missing physical will. "Maybe the code to the real location is on the tape." Richard pressed the play button. The machine hummed with static for a few grueling seconds before a voice filled the room. Sharp, resonant, and disturbingly clear. It wasn't the raspy breath of the dying man in the bed. It was the voice of the titan they had once feared. "My dear children." The recording began, a touch of dark amusement in the tone. If you are hearing this, it means you chose to open the vault while I was still drawing breath. You chose a combination of numbers over the hand of your father. You searched for my ending before I was even finished. Mark felt a chill crawl up his spine. He looked at Thomas, but the old man's eyes were closed now. You believe wealth is something that can be inherited, the voice continued. But true legacy is something you find where only love, or perhaps desperation, can lead you. My fortune isn't in this safe. It is hidden within the heart of this house. To find it, you must look where the memories are kept. The recording ended with a sharp click. The heart of the house. Richard kicked a velvet footstool across the room. He's talking about the library, or the wine cellar. Desperation, like a poison, began to seep into the siblings. The storm outside intensified, lightning flashing across the room, illuminating the greed etched into their features. They no longer saw their father as a human being. He was a map they were failing to read. Richard turned to the nightstand, grabbing his father's half-empty water glass. If he wants to play games, fine, but he won't be playing them with a full stomach. He poured the water onto the thick carpet. Mark, Julianne, go to the library. Tear the walls down if you have to. I'll stay here and make sure our dear old dad remembers exactly how much he needs us. Over the next few hours, the manor was filled with the sounds of destruction. Julianne and Mark tore through the library, pulling centuries-old leather-bound books from the shelves, smashing porcelain vases, and ripping up floorboards. Richard, meanwhile, sat in the dark by his father's bed, leaning in to whisper threats into a deaf ear, withholding the hourly medication that kept Thomas's pain at bay. He didn't notice that the paralyzed fingers of Thomas's right hand were slowly, rhythmically tapping against the wool blanket. He didn't see the way Thomas's breathing had shifted from a labored struggle to a steady, military-like cadence. The vultures were so busy tearing the house apart that they forgot one simple rule of the wild. Never assume an old lion is dead just because he is quiet. They were looking for gold, but Thomas was preparing the fire. The library of Blackwood Manor was a cavernous hall of knowledge, smelling of vanilla-scented rot and ancient parchment. Usually, it was a place of profound silence, but tonight, it was a war zone. Julianne had traded her designer heels for flat boots, her hair disheveled as she threw a first-edition Dickens against the wall in a fit of pique. Mark was on his knees, a crowbar in hand, prying up the mahogany floorboards near the fireplace. Where are the memories kept? Mark growled, wiping sweat from his forehead. Photos? Diaries? We've shredded every album in this room and found nothing but sentimental garbage. Julianne stopped, her eyes landing on the massive oil painting that dominated the far wall. It was a portrait of their grandmother, a woman whose stern gaze had always unnerved her. Wait, she whispered, her voice trembling with a sudden realization. The heart of the house. Dad used to say grandmother was the heartbeat of his empire. She started the shipping line with a single rowboat. She rushed to the painting, her fingers clawing at the ornate gilded frame. Mark, help me move this. Together, they heaved the heavy canvas aside. Behind it, concealed within the stone masonry of the chimney breast, was a small, inconspicuous wooden lever. With a gut-wrenching groan of stone against stone, a section of the shelving swung inward, revealing a pitch-black cavity. A secret room, Mark breathed, his eyes wide with a manic light. They stepped inside, their flashlights cutting through decades of undisturbed dust. The room was small, more of a vault than a study. In the center sat a simple, handcrafted wooden chest. It wasn't the sleek, digital safe they had seen in the bedroom. This was old world. This was the heart. With a frantic kick, Mark broke the rusted lock. The lid creaked open, and for a moment, the siblings were blinded. Not by gold, but by the crisp, white reflection of paper. Thousands of them. Neatly bundled stacks of high-denomination currency, $100 bills, grouped into bricks that filled the chest to the brim. It's here, Julianne shrieked, plunging her hands into the money. There must be 20, 30 million here in cash. Mark grabbed a bundle, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. But as he flicked through the bills with his thumb, his triumphant grin faltered. He held a bill up to his flashlight, then another, then a third. A cold, leaden weight settled in the pit of his stomach. Julianne, he said, his voice suddenly hollow. Look at the corners. Julianne snatched a stack and looked. Every single bill in the chest had a jagged, precise triangular notch cut out of the upper right corner. "What does it mean?" she asked, her voice rising in panic. "Is it some kind of mark of ownership?" Mark, whose legal career had been built on the fringes of financial shadow work, turned as pale as the paper in his hands. "No," he whispered. "This is mutilated currency. These bills were pulled from circulation. In the banking world, this is paper that has been scheduled for destruction. It's been demonetized." "Demonetized?" Julian echoed. "You mean it's fake?" "Worse," Mark groaned, dropping the stack as if it had turned into a poisonous snake. "It's real ink and real paper, but it has zero legal value. It's garbage. Unless..." "Unless what?" Mark stood up, his eyes darting around the secret room. "Unless there is a certificate of restoration. A single legal document issued by the central bank that validates a specific hoard of recovered or damaged currency. Without that piece of paper, we are literally holding a chest full of kindling." "Where is it?" Julian screamed, grabbing him by the lapels. "Where is the certificate?" "Think," Mark yelled back. "Where would he keep the only thing that makes this pile of paper worth millions? He told us on the tape. He said true legacy is found where only love leads." He didn't mean grandmother. He meant himself. In the master bedroom, Richard was still sitting in the shadows, oblivious to the discovery in the library. He was leaning over his father's bed, his face twisted into a mask of cruelty. "They've found it by now, old man," Richard hissed, reaching out to pinch the skin on Thomas's arm. "You thought you were so clever, hiding it away. But you're just a broken body in an expensive bed. Once they bring the deeds up, I'm calling the funeral home. I think tonight is a good night for you to stop fighting." He reached for the oxygen mask, his hand hovering over the plastic seal. "Goodbye, Dad." Suddenly, the paralyzed right hand of Thomas shot upward. With the speed and strength of a man half his age, Thomas gripped Richard's wrist. The sound of bones cracking echoed in the quiet room. Richard let out a muffled shriek, falling to his knees as the old man he thought was a vegetable sat upright with terrifying grace. Thomas reached into his pajama pocket and pulled out a small, laminated slip of paper, the certificate of restoration. He looked at his eldest son, not with the eyes of a victim, but with the cold, calculating gaze of the man who had once been known as Mathew, the survivor of the great snowstorm. "You were always a poor student of history, Richard," Thomas said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated with power. From the hallway, the panicked footsteps of Julianne and Mark grew louder. They burst into the room, gasps of "it's all worthless" dying in their throats as they saw their father standing by the window, silhouetted by a sudden flash of lightning. Thomas held the gold lighter in one hand and the multi-million-dollar certificate in the other. He flicked the lighter. A small, hungry flame danced in the darkness. "Now," Thomas whispered, the spark in his eyes reflecting the fire. "Let's see how much your greed is worth when it's turned to ash." The master bedroom, once a sanctuary of sterile silence and impending death, had transformed into a theater of the macabre. Richard lay on the floor, clutching his shattered wrist, his face a mask of disbelief and agony. Julianne and Mark stood frozen in the doorway, the stench of dust from the secret room still clinging to their clothes, their eyes wide as they beheld the resurrection of the man they had already tried to bury. Thomas, or rather, the man the world once knew as Mathew, did not look like a stroke victim. Standing by the window, the silk of his pajamas fluttering in the draft, he looked like a statue carved from granite. The frailty that had defined him for the last month had evaporated, revealed to be nothing more than a masterfully maintained costume. "Dad," Julianne's voice was a thin, pathetic reed. You can walk? You can talk." Mathew turned his head slowly, his gaze raking over her like a searchlight. "I have walked through storms that would have frozen your soul, Julianne. I have spoken to men who would make your brother's petty cruelties look like child's play. Do you really think a little burst of blood in the brain was enough to end me?" He looked down at Richard, who was whimpering on the rug. Mathew's expression didn't hold hatred. It held something much worse, profound disappointment. "You turned off my hearing aid, Richard. You thought you were silencing my world, but all you did was give me the perfect silence in which to listen to your true hearts. I heard every word, every plan to carve up my life's work, every joke about my labored breathing. It was a joke, a misunderstanding." Mark stammered, stepping forward, his hands raised in a placating gesture. We were just stressed, Thomas. The pressure of the estate. Silence, counselor. Mathew barked, the authority in his voice slamming into Mark like a physical blow. You weren't stressed. You were salivating. I watched you through half-closed eyes as you guided my hand to write that code. You didn't see a father. You saw a key to a vault. Mathew held up the gold lighter. With a practiced flick of his thumb, the flame hissed into existence. In his other hand, he held the certificate of restoration, the only document in existence that could turn the $30 million of mutilated currency in the basement into legal tender. No, Richard gasped, pushing himself up with his good hand. Dad, don't. That's our future. That's the Blackwood legacy. Legacy, Mathew echoed, a bitter smile touching his lips. You think legacy is a number in a ledger? I built this empire with sweat, blood, and the memory of a night spent in a snowstorm where I learned that the only thing you truly own is your character. I tried to teach you that. I gave you everything so you would never have to feel the cold I felt. He stepped closer to the three of them, the small flame casting long, dancing shadows that made him look 10 feet tall. But I failed, Mathew continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. By shielding you from the storm, I made you soft. By giving you gold, I made you hollow. You are not my heirs. You are parasites who have mistaken my kindness for weakness. Please, Julianne sobbed, dropping to her knees. We're your children. You can't leave us with nothing. We have debts. We have lives. You have the lives you chose, Mathew countered. And tonight, I am choosing to be the father you deserved, rather than the one you wanted. A father teaches lessons. And this is the final one. He held the laminated certificate over the flame. The plastic began to curl and blacken. Stop, Mark screamed, lunging forward, forgetful of his caution. Mathew didn't flinch. He simply pivoted, his movement fluid and precise, catching Mark with a backhand that sent the younger man sprawling back into the hallway. The money in that chest is exactly what you are, Mathew said, looking at the blackened edge of the document. It looks real. It feels real. But it has no value. It is disconnected from the system that gives it meaning, just as you have disconnected yourselves from this family. He touched the flame to the corner of the paper. It didn't burn fast. The lamination made it melt and drip like dark tears. The siblings watched in a trance of horror as millions of dollars dissolved into foul-smelling smoke. There goes the house in the Hamptons, Richard, Mathew narrated with chilling calm. There go the diamonds, Julianne. There go the offshore accounts, Mark. With a final breath, Mathew blew out the lighter. The room plunged into darkness for a second before a flash of lightning revealed him standing there, holding only a pile of curled, worthless ash. He opened his hand, letting the remains of their greed flutter to the floor, settling like dead insects on the expensive carpet. The manor is still standing, Mathew said, his voice cold as the ice outside. But the fire is out. If you want to survive the night, I suggest you start looking for a way to keep yourselves warm. Because from this moment on, you are strangers under my roof. He walked past them, his footsteps firm and echoing, leaving them alone in the room with the smell of burnt plastic and the ruins of their own making. The Titan had returned, and the vultures were finally starving. The morning after the storm brought a silence to Blackwood Manor that was far more unnerving than the howling winds. The sky was a pale, mocking blue, reflecting off the pristine white sheets of snow that buried the world outside. Inside, the grand entrance hall felt like a tomb. Richard, Julianne, and Mark sat huddled together on the velvet sofa, still wearing the rumpled clothes from the night before. Their faces were hollowed by exhaustion and the sudden, crushing weight of poverty. The paralyzed old man they had planned to bury was gone from his room. In his place, a single envelope sat on the dining table, positioned precisely between 3 bowls of cold, watery oatmeal. Richard, his wrist crudely bandaged and his eyes bloodshot, reached for the envelope. His hands shook, not with the tremors of age, but with the vibration of a man who had lost his gravity. He tore it open. There was no legal document, no check, only a handwritten note and 3 keys attached to brass tags. The fire is out, the note read in Mathew's sharp, unwavering script. The accounts are closed. The empire you coveted was sold to a maritime conglomerate 6 months ago. The proceeds donated to this storm-found foundation for the displaced and abandoned. This house, however, remains. It is your inheritance. But a house is not a home unless it is earned. Look at the brass tags. Richard looked at the first key. The tag read, the boiler. Julianne's tag read, the kitchen. Mark's tag read, the garden. There are no servants coming today, the note continued. The pantry is stocked with basic grains. The woodpile is in the shed. If you want heat, you must chop the wood. If you want to eat, you must cook. If you wish to stay, you must maintain the grounds. For 40 years, I gave you the fruit without the labor. Now, you shall have the labor without the fruit. Prove you are more than parasites, and perhaps one day, I will tell you where I am. Richard let out a strangled cry of rage, throwing the key across the room. He can't do this. I'll sue. I'll find a way to break that sale. With what money, Richard? Mark asked, his voice dead. He stared at his own key. He stripped the offshore accounts. He knew every move I made. We have nothing but a massive, drafty house and 3 sets of chores. As the 3 heirs began to bicker, their voices rising in the same petty patterns of greed and blame, a small fishing boat was cutting through the choppy, frigid waters of the harbor, miles away from the manor. At the helm stood Mathew. He had shed the silk pajamas for a rugged, fleece-lined coat and a weathered captain's hat. The air was biting, the kind of cold that would have killed a lesser man. But to Mathew, it felt like oxygen. He looked at his hands, the hands that had built an empire, the hands that had been faked into paralysis, and finally, the hands that had burned a hollow legacy to save his children's souls. He reached into his inner pocket and pulled out a small, tattered photograph. It was the same one from the support center years ago, himself as Arthur Bennett, standing in the snow after being thrown out by his first son-in-law. He had lived 2 lives. One as Arthur, the victim of a storm. Another as Thomas, the creator of a storm. The cycle ends here, he whispered to the wind. He didn't hate his children. If he had hated them, he would have let them inherit the money and watched them destroy each other with it. By leaving them with nothing but work and each other, he had given them the only thing he had left to offer, a chance to become human. Mathew steered the boat toward a small, sun-drenched island on the horizon where a modest cottage waited. There would be no mahogany walls there, no safes, and no vultures. Only the sound of the sea and the peace of a man who no longer had to hide who he was. Back at the manor, a loud, rhythmic thwack echoed across the snowy lawn. Richard, his face red and tears of frustration freezing on his cheeks, was clumsily swinging an axe at a log. Inside, Julianne was scrubbing a pot, her manicured nails breaking against the steel wool. They were angry, they were miserable, but for the first time in their lives, they were doing something real. High above, perched on the gargoyles of the roof, the vultures finally flew away. There was nothing left here to scavenge. Mathew looked back one last time at the receding coastline of his former life. He took the gold lighter, the last remnant of the Titan, and tossed it into the deep blue water. It sank without a sound, a tiny spark extinguished by the vastness of the ocean. He was no longer a tycoon. He was no longer a victim. He was simply a man who had survived the cold, twice over. And as the boat hit the open sea, the sun finally felt warm.